Інший особистий ворог Владіміра Путіна – це відомий американський бізнесмен Білл Брowder, якого вшанувало нагородою Тризуба на великому банкеті в Торонто літом цього року. У своєму слові пан Брowder чітко нагадував кожному про суттєву загрозу, яку для цивілізованого світу представляє собою особа Путіна.
The Tryzub Awards would not be possible without a few members that are here today, of course. They were created by the Myhal Family Foundation, who saw a need to unify our community across Canada to celebrate the accomplishments of chosen individuals in their fields.
Bill Browder, what can I say about you? You were only bumped off of Putin's top 10 hit list because of President Zelensky. You are in very good company, my friend. And we cannot thank you enough for all that you do to support Ukraine.
I have the pleasure to introduce you this evening to Bill Browder, the recipient of the 2023 Tryzub Award in the category of Friend of Ukraine. His two best-selling books read like spy thrillers. In the explosive New York Times bestseller Red Notice, Bill Browder tells a story of corruption and murder in Vladimir Putin's Russia through the lens of his own business saga. And Red Notice, perhaps more importantly, lays the groundwork for the Magnitsky legislation. In his most recent book, Freezing Order, Bill provides a gripping thriller chronicling how he became one of Vladimir Putin's foremost enemies by exposing Putin's campaign to steal and launder hundreds of billions of dollars and kill anyone who stands in his way. This 2023 Tryzub Award, however, is not about his books, although very deserving. It is being bestowed upon Bill Browder for his tenacious and effective advocacy in compelling governments to adopt legislation in the name of his friend, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in a Russian jail for exposing the kleptocracy of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. The Magnitsky Act, which is now law in dozens of countries, including Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and European Union countries, provides a legislative framework for these countries to freeze assets and ban the visas of human rights violators worldwide. So in recognition of Bill Browder's dedication and contribution to justice and for taking on one of the most dangerous and ruthless villains in the world, I am pleased to bestow upon you, Bill Browder, the 2023 Tryzub Award for being a committed friend of Ukraine.
Putin smiled. He'd obviously been prepared for this question. And he said, yeah, it's possible that we could hand over these officers. But if we did, we would expect some reciprocity and goodwill from our American partners. Specifically, we would expect them to hand over Bill Browder, me. Of the 8 billion people on the planet, I'm the one guy being discussed at this thing. So that was unpleasant, but it wasn't unexpected. Since the passage of the Magnitsky Act in 2012, Putin has hated my guts. He's stolen an enormous amount of money in his life. He keeps a lot of that money offshore. And I've created a piece of legislation which could freeze that money and effectively take it away from him. And Putin is a guy who values money more than human life. And so he started chasing me around the world with all sorts of nastiness, with death threats, with kidnapping threats. I was sentenced to 18 years in absentia in Russia. They tried to use Interpol 8 times to have me arrested. They sent 12 mutual legal assistance requests for my extradition from London. They've sued me. They've done all sorts of stuff. And so the fact that Putin was angry with me, that wasn't a surprise. But what was a surprise was what happened next. The obvious question after Putin said this was to Trump, a different journalist. He said, Mr. President, what do you think of Putin's offer? And without skipping a beat, Trump said, "I think it's an incredible offer." So that was surprising. This is the most powerful man in the free world who was ready to hand me over to a murderous dictator who wanted to kill me. He actually didn't mean to say it was an incredible offer, but he meant to say it was an incredibly bad offer. But that didn't happen. So they get back to America, Trump's crew get back to America, and Putin goes back to Russia. And overnight, Putin realizes he made a terrible, terrible mistake. Putin he prides himself on being the meanest, toughest, most ruthless negotiator. And he realized, well, wait a second, the Americans asked for 12, and he only asked for 1. And so overnight, he kind of decided to change his offer. And so instead of just asking for me, he also wanted 11 others to make it symmetrical. Basically, everybody on his list was somebody who had been a friend of mine, either currently in the U.S. government or formerly in the U.S. government, who had helped on my campaign for justice. And now at this point, after he made this announcement, I was expecting immediately that the Trump administration would push back on this, because if they didn't, who would ever join the U.S. government again if some future president could hand you over to a hostile foreign power for the sole crime of doing your work as a policymaker? It's insane. Trump's press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, issues a very meek statement saying, "The president, while he understands that Putin's request was sincere, will be unable to honor it at this time." An hour later, the Senate voted 98-0 not to hand us over. And so when I say I'm delighted to be here tonight, I really am delighted to be here tonight. I want to just tell you a short story to connect what I've been doing, the Magnitsky murder, and what's happening now in Ukraine. Because I can draw a direct line between the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and the invasion of Ukraine. Sergei Magnitsky was arrested, tortured, and killed for exposing a $230 million government corruption scheme. And so in addition to getting the Magnitsky Act passed as part of my campaign for justice, I said, who got the money? Who got that $230 million? And as time went on, we were able to piece together who got the money. And probably the most significant data leak that happened that really defined everything for us was the Panama Papers. I'm sure some of you remember that, 2017. In the case of Russia, the anti-hero of the Panama Papers was a man named Sergei Roldugin. Sergei Roldugin was a cellist from St. Petersburg who had miraculously accumulated $2 billion. Now, being a cello player is not a very lucrative business. Well, it turns out that he's not just any ordinary cellist. He also happens to be Putin's best friend from childhood, the godfather of one of Putin's daughters, the person who introduced Putin to his first wife, and most importantly, Putin's nominee. I should say one of many of Putin's nominees. So this guy, Sergei Roldugin, is holding money for Putin. But this discovery of Sergei Roldugin was very significant for us, because as we were then, with this discovery from the Panama Papers, we were able then to compare it to this huge database that we had accumulated through all these data leaks and whistleblowers and law enforcement investigations. And we discovered that some of the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky had exposed and was killed over went to Sergei Roldugin. In other words, they went to Vladimir Putin. And that's one of the main reasons why Putin has been chasing me around the world, is because I was exposing a crime, a big crime, that he was a beneficiary of. So that was a pretty big discovery. But an even bigger discovery in this whole thing was, as we were accumulating all this information, we discovered that there was one bank, in a Danish bank called Danske Bank, that had laundered 200 million of the $230 million that Sergei was killed over. And one day, we got a phone call from a group of investigative journalists in Copenhagen, in Denmark, where the Danske Bank headquarters were. And they said, we've just gotten a huge data leak called the Russian laundromat. And we can't make heads or tails of all this, just too much information. But since you have now determined which offshore companies and bank accounts and bank managers, et cetera, were responsible for the 200 million of laundered money in the Magnitsky case, maybe we could somehow extrapolate that to some of this other information we have. And we said, of course, we'd love to help. We handed over our database, and they came back a couple days later after having put everything through, all their stuff through and compared it to our database. And they said, actually, the number wasn't 200 million. It was 8.3 billion of money stolen from Russia, laundered through Danske Bank. Now, Danske Bank is in Denmark. Denmark is considered to be the second most honest country in the world, according to Transparency International. And it's not as if you can be the CEO of a bank like that, have this kind, and this article was the most well-read article in the history of this newspaper. It's not like you can just say fake news and just shrug it off and hope that nobody's going to do anything about it. And so the CEO of the bank was forced by the people around him to look into this more carefully. And he ended up hiring an outside law firm, an outside accounting firm, an outside data analysis firm with all the data of the bank in his hopes to somehow refute this, this story from this newspaper about the 8.3 billion. And so this was a pretty time-consuming process because they were going to look at everything. And they come back a few months later, and they said, actually, the number is not 8.3 billion. It's $232 billion of dirty money stolen from Russia had been laundered through Danske Bank. $232 billion. And this is just one bank, one mid-sized Scandinavian bank where we've identified, where we lifted the hood and we found 232 billion. If we could lift the hood at Raiffeisen in Vienna and UBS and Credit Suisse in Zurich and Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt and a few other banks, I estimate that we would come to $1 trillion of dirty money that had been laundered, stolen from the Russian people and laundered and taken out of Russia. And this is money that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads, military, all sorts of stuff. Instead, it was spent on private jets and yachts, Swiss bank accounts, villas, and other things like that. You can get away with that as a kleptocrat for 2 years or 5 years, maybe for 10 billion or 20 billion. But to steal $1 trillion over a 22-year period, and this is not just Putin, but about 1,000 people around him, you end up in a really difficult situation because eventually people are just it's gonna blow up on you. And Putin understands that if he ever loses power, he loses all the money that he's stolen, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so here you have this man who has stolen too much money, is terrified for his own life, terrified of dying if his own people were ever to turn on him. And so what does a dictator do who's scared to death of his people being angry with him and getting rid of him? You start a war. You find a foreign enemy so the people aren't mad at you, they're mad at somebody else. And the war in Ukraine, which didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014, the war in Ukraine is a totally manufactured war. There is no fundamental beef that Russia has with Ukraine. They just made it up. They made up this war in order to have a foreign enemy. And this is a very terrible realization. And it's terrible for the following reason. Because if I'm correct about this, and I am correct about this, then you can't negotiate with this man. Because he's not doing this because of NATO enlargement. He's not doing this because of some grand vision of a Russian empire. He's just doing this to be at war. And therefore, there is not going to be a negotiated settlement. There can't be a negotiated settlement because he understands if he negotiates, he looks weak and he dies. And so there's only one of two outcomes in this whole thing. Either Russia wins or Ukraine wins. And God help us if Russia wins. God help the Ukrainians. God help the rest of us if Russia wins, because he's not going to stop. We all know that. He's not going to stop after Ukraine. He'll then be on the Estonian border. And then we have a horrible choice of either going to war with Russia ourselves or giving up on our NATO commitments, and then all of a sudden you're back in 1945 again. And so our only choice is to do everything humanly possible to help Ukraine win. And so my whole struggle started out with one murder of one man, which is Sergei Magnitsky. And now I've seen this terrible, murderous tyrant multiplying it out hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million times. And so for that reason, I am a friend of Ukraine. I'm going to do everything possible to help Ukraine in every possible way. Thank you very much.